I'm John Bell, and with me today is John Hawkins, Director of the Colorado Heritage Museum. We're in the parlor at Fairfield, which is located at 1436 Harper Avenue in Lenoir, a home whose construction was started in 1825 by James Harper.
I think you're right about the date, between 1825 and 1830, somewhere along there. Do we know the exact date?
I've read between 1825 and 1829.
I think I've heard the same thing, yes.
Apparently James Harper, as a young man growing up in Fairfield, Pennsylvania, outside of Gettysburg, developed a lung ailment of some type, and his doctor advised him to move south in the early 1820s. He traveled through several states, including West Virginia and Ohio, and as far south as Charleston, South Carolina, and then came back to Wilkesboro and struck up a friendship and a business partnership with John Wall. Can you tell us something about John Wall and his
I just story? Know that he and Mr. Harper were business partners, and apparently they started what we would call today a chain of stores. They had several, I think, which is kind of an unusual thing for that time period.
It is. So James Harper established a store on this property, and it was a general store selling general merchandise, right, and operated it until apparently the late 1860s, at which time it moved to downtown Lenoir and eventually evolved into Bernhardt Siegel Company.
Right. He also had a store in downtown Lenoir, I think, from the very beginning of the town, but I think I have read somewhere too that he may have had two stores, one here and one in downtown Lenoir.
Right. Yep. Interestingly, when the store was torn down on this property in the late 1860s, the building materials were used to build this wing of the house, this room and the room above it.
Right. And now I know that the house was built in portions. There was the original section he built probably between 1825 and 1830. And then was the next addition in the 1860s when you're talking about, or was there another one in between?
There was the dining room and the bedroom above it were built in 1843.
Okay.
James Harper married Caroline Ellen Finley from Augusta County, Virginia in 1833. So they were, I guess, lived in the four-room house until 1843 when they added the two rooms.
Mm-hmm. In 1843, they had, 3 or 4 children, so I guess they needed that additional room.
I'm sure they did. Their children were G.W.F. Harper, Samuel Harper, and 2 daughters, Cornelia and Mary.
Right.
Yeah. And Mary and Cornelia married brothers, the Bell brothers from Linwood, which is in Davidson County.
Right.
And both of them were doctors.
Right.
And Cornelia moved to Linwood, and where her husband was a farmer and a doctor, and Robert Lamar Bell married Mary and lived at this house.
Right. Mm-hmm. I read just recently Robert Lamar Bell's obituary, and apparently he was a very widely respected physician and man.
Yes, I read that article also. That you did, and I appreciate you doing that in the news topic. And also James Harper's obituary,
right,
from 1879.
They were both widely respected men, and they were citizens of the community. They looked out for the community as well as their own interests.
Right.
And they were very philanthropic, it seems, in their outlook.
And apparently Robert Lamar Bell treated people who couldn't afford to pay him, and they bartered and that kind of thing. And I have a cousin who has his medical saddlebags, and he apparently rode on his horse and treated people in a fairly wide area.
Right. I suspect he was the typical country doctor who went. Most of them, it seemed, did house calls rather than having an office where people came to.
Right. We actually have a couple of his dress shirts. He was a very small man, okay, probably had a 14-inch neck, and it's the style is unusual, and the way they put the collars on separately from the shirt and that kind of thing.
Right. And of course his descendants continued to live here in the community and to give back to the community in various ways too.
Yeah, right. The farm that James Harper built had approximately 29 outbuildings, including barns, an ice house. There was a pond down across from the current Fairfield chair office, and an ice house, and where they would cut ice in the winter and bury it in sawdust and use it during the summer. The only building that's still standing is the smokehouse, which is now a storage area.
Right. Yeah. The way they store the ice always amazes me. It's hard for me to imagine they could store ice in sawdust and have it all summer, but apparently it worked.
It must have.
Because they were not the only family I heard that did that too.
Right.
So it must have been something that was widely known.
Right, and apparently the pond was a popular social venue during the winter when they would ice skate and have bonfires.
There's one of the diaries of one of the girls who went to Davenport College tells about they went there and skating, and one of the girls fell through the ice.
Oh, really? Wow.
And
Yeah.
so, it was a popular place for recreation, it seems.
Right. Robert Lamar Bell and Mary had, I think, 4 girls and one son.
Right.
The son was James Harper Bell, and he was born in 1868. I'm not sure the dates on my great aunts, but all of them, as far as I know, were artists. And we still have some of their paintings. And they were very talented. Harper Bell was a banker in Lenoir. He and George Harper started the Bank of Lenoir in 1905. And there's a notation in G.W.F. Harper's diary in 1904. He said, "Son George and Harper Bell think they can run a bank. I doubt it." And the bank went on until 1958 when it was sold to First Union.
I think they proved they could run a bank.
I think they did. Yeah.
I remember my dad talking as a young man here in town, that would have been in the late 20s, early 30s, that he knew Mr. Bell as a banker.
Right.
At that, and apparently he was, again, another widely respected man who was known apparently for fair dealing and helping people in any way he could.
Yep. And
he inherited this house, am I right?
he did. Well, his mother lived, I think, until 1916, and she lived here, and he inherited the house at that point. And in 1923, he did a total renovation to the house. Mm-hmm. And as you mentioned earlier, it was built in stages, and the brick that was used in the different phases didn't match. Mm-hmm. So my grandfather stuccoed the house to make it all uniform, put in the first heating system. Until that time, the house was heated by fireplaces in every room, of course. And the kitchen before that time was an outbuilding, and he incorporated that into the house. So it kind of became a little more modern than it had been.
John, I understand that the brick that were on the original house were ballasts that came into some of the ships, perhaps in the Charleston area.
That's my understanding, and the brick was apparently hauled to Lenoir in wagons. Apparently, it was ballast brick to weight the ships down as they came over from England to take raw materials back to England, and it was apparently not very pretty brick. And then as the subsequent additions were made to the house with different brick, it didn't match. So in 1923, that's when my grandfather stuccoed the house and stuccoed over the brick that existed, and as a result, in 1969, my dad renovated the house, bricked it again over the stucco, and that resulted in the walls in most places being 22 inches thick. So there were two courses of brick and then the stucco in between. So
this is just about a fortress, then, it would seem.
Well, yes.
John, there's some interesting stories connected with the front room up there that I've heard. Perhaps you could relate a couple of those stories to us.
what was always called the front room, and still is a small den that was one of the original rooms in the house. Two interesting stories about it. I don't recall the year of Stoneman's raid. Was it 1865?
1865, yes.
Some of his men came to this house, and my great-great-grandmother, Caroline Harper, was sick in bed in that room. And the soldiers were wanting the valuables that the family owned, mainly the silver and the horses. James Harper had apparently taken those items, the horses and the silver, to High Brighton to hide them from the Union forces. And the soldiers took hot coals in a warming pan and held them over my great-great-grandmother and threatened to burn her with them if she didn't tell. And then they heard horses coming up the road and decided there might be some local militia, and they left and apparently went to where they were bivouacking at the Episcopal Church at that time.
Right.
Another story, an interesting fact about that room is that my great-grandmother, Mary Harper Bell, was born in that room, married in that room, and died in that room. So not many people can make that claim about a room.
The purpose of the room changed through the years.
Absolutely.
From a bedroom to a parlor to
and then back to a bedroom. That's correct. It really changed the looks of the house, I'm sure, in 1923. And I've seen it written up in several. I remember being in history, in a history course at Chapel Hill, and we were talking about North Carolina history, and Fairfield was one of the homes in that book.
Okay.
So my dad did that renovation in 1969. Added an apartment, renovated the kitchen and the heating system, and redecorated the house. And he and my mom lived here until her death in 1997 and his in 1999. And before his death, he donated the house and the property to the First Presbyterian Church. First Presbyterian Church has always played a big part in the lives of the Bell and Harper families.
Right.
In fact, James Harper in the 1840s built what was called Fairfield Church,
Right.
which was on Bell Street near the intersection of Spring Street. And it was a non-denominational church, as I understand, but there were a lot of Methodists here, and there was no Presbyterian church. James and Caroline Harper hired a governess or teacher to teach their children. Her name was Emma Baker, and she was from England, from Brighton, England, actually. And in 1852, James and Caroline Harper and Emma Baker started the First Presbyterian Church in Lenoir. And where the Fairfield Church was is still a cemetery with grave markers dating back to the early 1800s. And I was up there recently. It's very interesting to look at those graves.
And it's interesting to note too, the Fairfield Chapel or the Fairfield Church was actually the mother church of both the First United Methodist Church and the First Presbyterian Church. Both of those congregations used it in their early days.
Yes. And in the 1940s, my grandfather, Harper Bell, was instrumental in starting Fairview Church, which is here on Harper Avenue.
Right. Yes. And I think some of the family was also connected with what was a Beatty Memorial Presbyterian Church out in Balmead.
Correct.
Though it is now, I think, part of the United Presbyterian Church that's here in the city.
Okay. Right. Okay.
Yes, certainly the Presbyterian faith has played a large role in your family's background.
Yes. And because of that association, that's why the house was given to the church. And the idea is for the church to be a retreat, a place for people, for ministers to study, do sabbaticals, for circle groups to meet, and Bible studies, and receptions and other functions. It's available to the community for that use.
And it's a beautiful setting for that type of thing.
Right. This is a painting of James Harper Bell. James Harper Bell was born in 1868 and lived until June 2nd, 1954. His first job was as the telegraph operator for the Green Park Hotel in Blowing Rock, which was built by his uncle, G.W.F. Harper. He and George Harper started the Bank of Lenoir in 1905, and he served as president of that bank, various offices, until he became president of the bank and did not retire, but held that office until his death in 1954. This is a portrait of Elizabeth Fulton Lindsay Bell. She was married to James Harper Bell in 1905. They were the parents of 3 children and lived in this house until her death in 1968. The railroad that came to Caldwell County into Lenoir in the 1880s terminated on one end in Chester, South Carolina, and the other in Lenoir. And she was born and raised in Chester, and she and my grandfather met because of the railroad. This is a portrait of Burgess Lamar Bell. Burgess Bell was born in 1799 in a community called Linwood in Davidson County. He was a farmer and a doctor, and he was also the father of 2 sons, both of whom were doctors, who married James Harper's 2 daughters. Burgess Bell died in 1853. We're in the dining room at Fairfield, and this is a portrait of James Harper. James Harper was born in 1799 and died in 1879. He was the builder of the first 4 rooms of Fairfield, operated a fairly large farm here. He was the postmaster of Lenoir and donated 30 acres which became the downtown of Lenoir in 1841. This is a portrait of my dad, James Harper Bell Jr. He was born in 1918 and died in 1999. Dad was a local businessman and served as mayor of Lenoir from 1962 to 1968. And he is the one who donated Fairfield to the First Presbyterian Church. This is a portrait of my mother, Frances Lorraine Wilcox Bell. She was born in 1918 in Timmonsville, South Carolina, and grew up in Carthage, North Carolina. She and my dad were married in 1940 and were the parents of 4 children. She died in 1997.